Welcome back to another video. My name is Jessica. This is Chase. I'm a musician and I make wedding music planning approachable. In today's video, I'm going to be covering a very common question that I've received many times over the years from my clients. The question is, how many musicians should I hire for my ceremony? Now this is a very tricky question because there's a lot to consider. So I'm going to make things very simple for you today and break it down in a way that you can understand and help you make the best decision based on your vision and your budget. I want to begin by explaining the difference between a solo instrument and an accompaniment instrument. I like to just break the instruments down into these two categories because I think that makes it very simple. And if you're not a musical person, you may be kind of confused or intimidated by the musical terminology that we musicians use, like chords and harmony. And so I want to explain things in a way that everybody can understand. That way you feel looped in, you feel empowered, and you're better able to communicate with your musician or musicians. I also want to share some of the pros and cons to having one person playing versus multiple. And the best part, I'm going to share some examples with you today so you can actually hear it for yourself, because that's really the best way to make the decision, in my opinion, is to be able to hear it and see what resonates with you. And then finally, we're going to wrap things up with me giving you some of my recommendations, what I generally feel is the best decision based on what I've seen over the many years that I've been doing this. A solo instrument is an instrument that typically only plays one note or pitch at a time and carries a melody line very well. Some examples are violin, cello, flute, clarinet, saxophone, human voice. All of these instruments carry a melody really nicely. And a melody is generally the part of the song that you know. So if you think of just your favorite song, whatever comes to mind right now, and you just start humming it to yourself or singing it to yourself, you're going to be picking out the melody line. That's the part that most people know. Some examples of an accompaniment instrument are piano, guitar, organ, harp. These are all instruments that usually play more than one note or pitch at a time. This creates what we call a chord. Chords are used to accompany, to back up the melody line played by the solo instrument. And this can really change the sound of the melody. It can change the way that the listener's ears perceive it, because you're hearing it in a different context than if the melody was just by itself. Now let's talk about the pros and cons of hiring a solo musician versus hiring several musicians. The number one pro of having one musician is it's cheaper. Obviously, the more people that you hire, the more money you're going to have to spend. So if you hire a solo musician just playing a solo instrument, that's a great way to still have the magic of a live musical performance at your ceremony, but save some money. Another pro to having just one musician at your wedding is it's easier. If you have multiple musicians who don't normally work together or they're not part of one company, then that's more communication, there are more contracts and payments involved and things of that nature. So if you just have one person to communicate with, that makes it a lot easier and less stress for you. Now I like to make things easy for my clients. If they choose to hire a guitarist or a pianist or organist, then they do only have to communicate with me, and I handle all aspects of the finances and the music planning and the coordination, but not all musicians may work that way. So if you want to keep it simple, you can just hire one person. A con to hiring one solo musician is that your expectations may not quite be met. Now what I mean by that is a solo instrument, remember, can only play a melody line. So if you're used to hearing a certain song in its original format, the original recording, that solo instrument may not be able to recreate it exactly like you're used to hearing it. Here's an example for you. Let's say you've always had this dream of walking down the aisle to 1,000 Years by Christina Perri. That's been a really popular wedding song. So you've listened to the recording, the original, you got it on your Spotify playlist, you listen to it and you can just imagine walking down the aisle and it's so magical and perfect. So you hire a violinist to play the song and the violinist says, okay, right? They got it. I've done it many times, no problem. You're walking down the aisle and all you hear is da, 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 da. Kind of boring, right? So this is what I mean by how chords can change the way the melody is perceived. That's an example of a song that really kind of needs the chords so you can get a sense of the original song. So that's just something really important to keep in mind. It depends on the type of songs that you choose, honestly, but your musician should be knowledgeable enough to help you through that. And if they don't bring it up, then I would definitely ask them. Now, the pros to having an accompaniment instrument or hiring several musicians. I think the biggest pro to going with this option is that your song is going to sound a little more complete. So whether you are choosing a classical song, or if you're into popular music or Broadway tunes, whatever it is, if you're used to hearing those songs in a certain way in their original format, multiple musicians or having that accompaniment instrument along with the solo instrument is going to recreate it a little more similarly. Now, of course, we don't want it to sound exactly the same. I honestly think part of what makes it really special, really neat, is that the instruments can arrange it in their own way. It's like a new special way of playing it for your wedding. But sometimes the chords really are needed to communicate the melody line the best way. Another pro to this option is that it creates, I think, a little more energy when you have a group of musicians performing together versus just having one. So if you're having a big guest list, it just looks more grand and more full, more energetic to have a group. Now, there are some cons to this option as well. I think the biggest con is money. Of course, it's going to cost more money to have multiple musicians, but remember, you can always just go with solo and accompaniment. It doesn't have to be a string quartet. Another con to this option that might happen, depends on who you're hiring, is that there could be some difficulties in communication. If you're working with people who are independent musicians and they haven't worked a lot together or they don't belong to the same company, then it might be more communication and coordinating things on your end. Also, you really want to make sure you speak to your musicians up front when they give their fee. Make sure you know what's included in that cost, because some of them might charge extra for having to do particular arrangements of songs with these other musicians. They might try to charge you extra fees for rehearsals that are needed if these are not people they've worked with a lot, or if you're requesting a song that they haven't done. So just make sure you have that conversation up front so there aren't any surprises. Now I'm going to demonstrate the difference between a solo instrument all on its own and an instrument with an accompaniment instrument backing it up with the chords. I'm going to be playing violin solo and then violin with a piano. Of course, this isn't the only combination. These aren't the only options for wedding music, but violin is my specialty, and I think this will be a nice way for you to see the difference and how a song can sound different with and without that accompaniment. For today, I'm just going to stick with two very classic, really popular classical wedding tunes that you probably know, actually. And I want you to take note of how your ears perceive the sound differently when that piano accompaniment comes in. instrument, one musician, is a great option for smaller weddings. And I don't mean casual necessarily. It can still be very classy and elegant, but just have a small number of people in attendance. So I'm thinking anywhere from 50, 75, even 100. One musician is perfectly fine. Now remember, one musician can amplify, so it's not a matter of volume here. I can put my violin through a speaker, run it through, and I can be loud enough for hundreds of people to hear me. But it's more about having the right ratio. So 50 to 100, I think one is perfectly fine. I have found that solo violin has been a great option for my brides that have done smaller outdoor weddings at parks and farms and wineries, little backyard gatherings, and even a lot of indoor weddings at venues that are specifically for weddings. If the space is not super large, like a grand hall or something, one musician is more than enough. It's perfect, it sets the tone. If you're having a rather large guest list, I really think that you need to have at least one other musician and accompaniment instrument to play along with the solo instrument. I'm talking about 100 to 150 and up. Now again, this isn't a matter of volume because any instrument can amplify to reach the back row. It's more about that ratio. It's more about fitting the space. It just seems awkward to me to have 400 guests and one little violin. So having that accompaniment instrument is really going to round out the quality of the sound. Now if you are Catholic, I do want to mention this. You absolutely 100% without a doubt, no exceptions, have to have an accompaniment instrument, and you have to have a vocalist because you have to actually have this vocalist to lead the church service, the Mass. They serve as what's called a cantor. So in that case, you're gonna have to have a pianist, an organist, somebody, but usually the church has someone there that they can recommend if you don't have someone in mind. All right, there you have it, all the information you need to decide if you should hire one musician for your wedding or multiple musicians. I truly hope this video was helpful to you and informative. If it was, I'd really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you are planning a wedding or you're soon to be engaged and will be planning, then make sure you hit that subscribe button and the notification bell so you get future updates on more content that I will be releasing on wedding music planning. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and until next time, happy planning!